we haven't really managed in the past, and I'm very grateful that that you are here and that you, Professor Görner, Rüdiger Görner, is presenting his book, The Marbel Song. And it will be a mix of readings and conversations with Rosie Goldsmith. You know each other well. Can everybody please mute themselves? That would be very nice. Otherwise, we have to do it centrally, but I would want to avoid doing that centrally. And
if you could also mute yourselves and turn off your video, just so you'll still be able to hear and see everything, but it would just be better for the event. Can you do that? That'd be wonderful. No, you can't switch off the
muting is on the left, on the bottom left, just simply the microphone there, if you click on that.
And then the video is a similar icon. It's just the little camera icon. There's somebody else there on an iPhone.
What we can do, Rosie, I will mute all now, and then Rosie and Rüdiger, you unmute yourselves, and the others don't touch it, please. Yeah. So again, welcome, Professor Rüdiger Görner. He is the founding director of the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations at Queen Mary University in London. And you are calling us from London, joining from London today. So welcome to you. Rosie will introduce you with even more detail. And again, very briefly to you, Rosie, you are from the Rosie Goldsmith from the European Literature Network. I understand you also work with the BBC quite a lot, and you have kindly volunteered to moderate and introduce Rüdiger Görner today to all of us. So final excuse from myself that I am at the airport, but I will and have passed the host already to Rosie and to Rüdiger, so it should really be no problem for the call. So I will also drop off at some point, but you go on and let's not worry about me. I'm in safe hands here in the airport. So over to you, Rosie, and grateful for both of you to join, interested to hear about the Marbel Song.
Thank you so much, Peter Brock, and it's really wonderful to meet you and to be transported back to North Rhine-Westphalia, which is where I spent many, many happy student years at Cologne University. So it's very close to my heart. And also welcome to everybody at the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. And welcome to my dear colleague, Professor Rüdiger Görner, who is also, he's in London at the moment. I'm in Wiltshire, so not too far away. And Peter, I know, is about to disappear. Luckily, very lucky for him, he's going to go on a plane somewhere soon. But just to tell you, we're recording this, and so it will be available later. If you know anybody who might want to watch this particular event, you can still hear the pinging of a few more people joining us. I'll make sure that everybody is able to enter the Zoom meeting, as they call it, Zoom event. But as soon as you are with us, if I could just tell you before we get on to the actual event, if you could mute yourselves and also switch off your video. And as soon as we start the questions, which will be after the readings and the discussion, we'll make sure that everybody is visible and able to participate. And that'll be in just under an hour's time. So first of all, it's just me and Rüdiger, which is also very nice indeed. Now, before we talk about the novel, let me tell you a little bit about our guest, Rüdiger Görner, as I see him. He, I think, is one of Germany's finest exports to Britain, and we're very lucky to stake a claim to him. He's quite simply a German-British phenomenon. And I'm going to stick with words beginning with P, if I may. He's also prolific, he's pioneering and personable. He's tirelessly engaged in the creative pursuit of excellence and of meaning in his life and work. And if I were to describe a British author in that way, they might run a mile, but thank goodness he's German. Or is he? Who is Rüdiger Görner? Now, when I first met him at the Globe Theatre in London many years ago, I don't know whether you remember that, Rüdiger, he had helped set up the Shakespeare is German Festival in Britain. And I was reporting on it for the BBC, where I worked for 20 years. And I interviewed Rüdiger at length. And by the end, he had indeed convinced me that Shakespeare was German and taught me all I needed to know about Shakespeare's German contemporaries, German translators, and all the other German authors I had studied at university, and many I had not. I then had the pleasure of meeting Rüdiger at various Anglo-German events in this country, in Britain as well. And for a few years myself gave talks to his students at Queen Mary University. He was awarded the Bundesverdienstkreuz, the German Order of Merit, for fostering Anglo-German relations, as well as several other major honours. Rüdiger has written countless books and essays, and I mean countless, you try counting them, about German language and literature, from Goethe to Georg Trakl to Hölderlin's Stifter to Thomas Bernhard, Rilke to Thomas Mann, also writing on Kokoschka, Beethoven, Bruckner, many, many more. His creative interests encompass all the arts. And he's written several novels and poetry himself in German. Tonight, we're celebrating Rüdiger Görner's first novel written in English, The Marbel Song, which we're launching here and now with you. Now, welcome properly, wholeheartedly, dear Rüdiger. And my very first question is, what took you so long to write a novel in English? You've done everything else.
I think, Rosie, it's a very fine question indeed. What is the reason for that? Well, I think it was more than anything else a deep respect for the English language. And it took me indeed a while to, shall we say, master the basics to an extent that the basics would turn into some subtleties. And I dare say writing an essay in English also is not an easy task by any means, because the English culture of essay writing is, in my view, still exemplary. And it has a lightness of touch, which is something that one can only hope to aspire to. And I never felt, at least not for a long time, that my command of English would in fact be sufficient to sustain, shall we say, a story or episodes or anything that I felt I could do with, shall we say, more accomplishment in German. So the reason why it has taken a fair number of years, you're absolutely right, Rosie, is very much that. I think it is, to a certain extent, a compliment simply to the English language.
Do you now see yourself, do you feel bilingual in both languages? I mean, you've been here a long time, various posts, you've been at Queen Mary nearly 20 years, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And in Britain now, in fact, in this very month, 40 years. I would still not regard myself as bilingual, no. This has a great deal to do with, shall we say, a sense of reflection that creeps in here and there when you want to say certain things. And there is, of course, a difference in the sense that I think you are simply differently spontaneous in various languages, and spontaneity, or the way you reflect, the way you give your repartees, that actually changes also in tone, in temperament, in rhythm even, in English or in German. So no, I would still not say that I'm properly bilingual.
This novel is written in English. It's about an Englishman called Lionel Flower. Before I ask you to give a little bit of the synopsis and tell us about the wonderful Lionel, can you explain why you felt you had to write this novel in English? Why didn't you write it in German and then translate it?
I'm actually quite poor when it comes to translating my own texts into either English or German. It was, in fact, slightly the other way around. The plot itself, once it had shaped itself in my mind, called for this to be written in English. For reasons that are not so clear to me either. There was a certain demand of this story, of this plot on me to bring this across in English. And I think the combination of a different sense of irony, a different sense of allusions, a different sense of what one can bring across meaningfully, given the type of characters, did not just only suggest to write this in English, but in fact compelled me to write this in English. And when I say the characters, I certainly mean their voices. And their voices were right from the beginning distinctly in English. Lionel Flower, as you point out, yes, he is a strange character. He has to be strange, otherwise it's not worth writing about him. But the strangeness also comes from the way in which he himself perceives voices, the way in which he perceives others, objects, and how he manages more or less to bring himself into this kind of dialogue with what he sees. And in a sense, there is a fair amount of, I dare say, indirect dialogue in this text. It's a dialogue between Lionel and, frankly, what he sees and whom he encounters.
Now, I spoke, some might think, rather grandly about this pursuit of life and excellence and your creative pursuits and so on, but this is in fact what the book is about. And it's also about the fact that Lionel, who is a journalist, an English journalist writing very broadly for an unnamed magazine or newspaper, he is constantly questioning who he is and what he's doing on this earth by not doing an awful lot about it. An awful lot seems to happen to him. But it is basically, it is a pursuit of self, of him trying to find out who he is. Now, you've written it as a narrative. It is in the voice of an Englishman. He's obviously very English in so many ways. And I wondered how easy or difficult it was for you to actually become an Englishman, because it is something I imagine that took a little bit of exercise, a little bit of work.
Yes, indeed. I think it took, most importantly, a fine ear, because you need to somehow suss out what is meant by certain innuendos, what is meant by certain comments in certain situations. And you are bound, especially the first couple of years after arrival here in 1981 following, you are bound to make mistakes. You're bound to make social blunders. This is part of it. And this becoming of an Englishman, yes, perhaps it is becoming someone who really continues to be in between. I don't think you ever arrive in another culture. You can touch upon it, you can explore it, you can write about it, but you don't really 100% arrive in that other culture, as much as you don't ever leave your origins, or you have to sometimes redefine your origins. That also happens, and you often do that when you encounter what is nowadays called, with this grand word, otherness. When you encounter otherness, when you encounter the other, you of course also begin to rediscover yourself, and you discover your own reactions towards the other or the other culture. So this is in a sense also the reason why I feel this encounter with others is something that Lionel Flower does from an English perspective, however, because he encounters some very particular figures, female figures, who represent other cultures, Swiss culture, American culture, yes, also fellow English females. But whomever he encounters, he will make use of this encounter to re-encounter himself. I think
before this sounds a little bit too esoteric for people who haven't yet read it, because I can guarantee that as soon as you've read it, or when you've read it, all will become clear, or almost clear, which is the nature of a good piece of fiction, I hasten to add. There's always a little bit left unexplained at the end. But let's talk a little bit more about Lionel and the characters and his encounters, if you like. Now, you call him Lionel Flower. You give him his full name in the same way as, say, Gregor Samsa had his full name. And there are, for me, reading this, there are echoes of Kafka, there are echoes of Joyce, there are all kinds of echoes through this. And and he goes on a kind of journey. Lionel Flower goes on a journey to, London, Lucerne, Belfast. He meets all these really interesting, eccentric people. He seems to go for the eccentric people, and he has a pursuit. And we will talk about his female interests in greater detail. I know you've got a super reading ready for us. But Lionel Flower, just to flesh him out a little bit, he's a journalist. He's a trader in truisms. He's a dreamer. He's a lover of solitude, of slightly strange foods, foreign foods. He collects candlesticks, and he's a writer. He's obsessed by words, and he's finding it difficult to write. He's a reader. He's an observer, and he adores wordplay. And he's always watching himself as though he's watching himself perform in some way. I think he's absolutely fascinating, and probably the most, I would say, the telling characteristic is he's yearning for something. He's really longing for something, and usually in the shape of a woman. So with all five senses, all alert to the sights, the smells, everything around him. Is he a real person for you, Lionel? Have you ever met him? Is he you, partly? Who is he?
First of all, I couldn't say it better than you have just summarized the character of Lionel Flower. Yes, to a certain extent, he's also flowery. I mean, in many ways, because as you say, he is in love with language. Mm. And because he is in love with language, he does find it difficult to write, because that's the ultimate challenge. How do you really express this love for language in a way that also needs to be somehow critical? It needs to be perceptive. It needs to do things with language. Well, who is he, and is he part of me? Yes, he's part of me, and he isn't. You mentioned a few potential influences here, and I can tell you straight away, I don't know any anxiety of influence. I think we need influence, and it would be silly to deny that there are particular writers, not only German, not only English or American or Anglophone writers, that have influenced my approach also to writing. I would always mention Russian writers too. I am a great admirer of Turgenev, for example. So this takes us back to the 19th century, but ultimately, that's not so important. Ultimately, what happened with Lionel, yes, you're right, he is on a voyage, he is on a journey. And on this journey, during this journey, he develops. This is a figure very much that developed whilst I was writing it, or whilst he was writing himself. And there is also a change here and there between Lionel writing about himself in the first person singular, and sometimes the narrator takes over and it's a he when we talk about him. And perhaps it is him who talks about himself in the he form, in the third person singular. So there are lots of changes going on in him, but you're right, the fundamental line is his yearning, yes. Mm. He is longing for something that he can't really define. Mm. And you're right, he is a journalist, yes, but he has other aspirations as well. He never depreciates his journalism, but he finds that here and there it would be nice to write perhaps a piece of fiction. Perhaps it would be nice to write a biography, which he will eventually be commissioned to do. But at the same time,
an autobiography. Sorry to interrupt, but an autobiography, because his editor has obviously suggested to him that he writes his autobiography, which I think is part of the crux of the story, because he says, but who am I? I have to have a biography if I'm going to write an autobiography. So that seems to be a kind of, if you like, a spur for the whole story and for his explorations.
Very true.
Well, I mean, I wonder too whether you'd like to mention probably his first major encounter in the book, who is a wonderful woman called Iris. And you've got a reading, I think, ready for us as well about Iris. And this is something, again, which I would love to bring up, is that you have a great sense of humor. And I'm not saying that Germans don't have a sense of humor, particularly the North Rhine-Westphalia, of course, they have a great sense of humor. And I spent many years going to the Kölner Carnival. Whether that's humor, I don't know. But anyway, to be discussed. But you have a very English sense of humor, I think, in some parts. And I really did. I was so amused at some of your character portrayals, and I think Iris is just the most wonderful character. Tell us a little bit about her, and then if you'd be kind enough to give us your reading, your first reading.
My first reading. Iris is a very, shall we say, oscillating character. She is, in some respects, very firm. She knows what she's doing, also it seems. She keeps inventories. She is someone who, from a professional point of view, she takes inventories. And that, however, shapes her outlook on life. It shapes her outlook on objects. It shapes her outlook on people. In a sense, she's not a collector, but she simply writes down, she has to write down what she sees in a flat, for example. She is, in that sense, a counterpart, as it were, of Lionel. Lionel can't really fathom her out. He can't make head or tail of her in many ways. And in a sense, he is probably also afraid that she will simply see him also as an object, as part of her inventory of encounters. So she is, yes, bizarre, but in a different way than Lionel is. And
this takes place in London, and he literally bangs into her, encounters her in a very dramatic way. Are you happy to read for us?
Yes, with pleasure.
I was going to call you Lionel, but your name's actually Rüdiger.
Yes, I'm not Lionel. I'm not Lionel at all.
It's happening. It's happening.
It's happening.
Over to you,
and Rosie, just to connect with your reference to autobiographical, yes, indeed, because this section at the beginning is called still semi-autobiographical. So here we go. This is when I met Iris. Iris was different and made a difference. One of Iris's favorite jobs, when she was fully made up, each side of her face at least matched the other, was to produce inventories for letting agents. This took her to houses and flats of all shapes and sizes that were about to be put on the market as fully or partly furnished lettings. She collected copies of her inventories, which she called her what is what. She was expected to list everything a landlord wanted to leave for his future tenant. This was the law, her boss always told her, even though she never produced a copy of that law. Iris knew that you could demand almost anything from people if you told them that something was the law, for nobody would ever challenge this reference. After all, who wants to expose his ignorance of the law? So the law apparently expected Iris to count and list all the cutlery, pots and pans, curtain rails and curtains, tables and chairs, beds and linen, mattresses and individual pieces of furniture, including descriptions of the state they were in. Iris listed the crockery and kitchen equipment, reported on the condition of the dishwasher and the washing machine. Her next to photographic memory enabled her to comment on the inventory in considerable detail and to compile her final report on the interior of a let when she was back home. In her dreams, she would say 12 spoons, 2 sofas, 1 freezer. She lived in other people's things. Last night, she told me that she saw all sorts of things swelling, mushrooms, flower stems, tubes, or even pulsating, cushions, duvets, carpets. She remembered their patterns. Her ability to remember carpet patterns was her speciality. In department stores, she would avoid the carpet section like the plague, for she would remember for days after the curves and crosses, the circles and squares. Certain names could upset her. One reason she would not have children was that she would have had to name them. She rejected this act of willfulness. It should be a human right to rename oneself, she claimed, already thinking in terms of a campaign to that effect. But then the inventory work took over again. I think she quite liked her own name, though, Iris, but only as long as I did not tell her that I found this name quite beautiful. She could not help talking about cupboards and wardrobes and shower curtains. When she referred to people's beddings, her voice tended to shriek. She had worked on a number of houses in Kensington owned by Punjabis and 2 by people from Yemen with sensational bedrooms, en suite, of course, with a lot of brass and oriental tiles, which Iris also recorded, even though they did not need to be featured in her report. Amazing patterns, mostly in gold and turquoise, with black fillings, some octagonal. I listened and realized that the one thing we had in common was a preference for turquoise. Admittedly, this was not much, but it was better than nothing. Iris was always in love with everything. She colored her hair at regular intervals, shades of mauve mostly, sometimes brazenly lilac with black streaks. She also kept a record of her color schemes. She was all records. I was certain these included her lovemaking achievements, yet she never said a word about her background, her parents, where she came from, what she had done previously. But somewhere I was convinced that was duly recorded as well. When we last met in town, Iris seemed distraught. She soon told me why. She had just done the inventory of a large flat owned by a Russian who was present when she listed the items that would remain in the flat when he rented it out. Iris was upset, not because he said that his genitals were also worth recording and were at the service of anyone who rented his luxury flat, but because he tore up an enlarged poster-sized photograph of a child, which had been left in the playroom by mistake. Iris asked if she could have the torn bits, at which he laughed, pushing the scraps into the waistband of his trousers. With a roaring voice, he invited her to examine him, but she threw the almost completed inventory at his feet and left. "It will cost you your job, I fear." "So be it," she said. After a pause in which she sorted her hair and readed her lips with the help of a hand mirror with an embroidered back, she added, "I need to be alone for a while, just by myself. I need time out, you know." She pointed at the square encircled by the constant flow of traffic and called it a tranquil oasis, a haven of shadows. The rustling of the leaves could not be heard above the roaring noise of planes. "Think of all these pilots as brothers of Icarus," she said. Whatever Iris was, mythology was not far. She then counted the number of oak trees and beeches, the number of benches and rose bushes at the southwest gate. It was soon clear that she was about to produce an inventory of this square. I left her doing it. She did not notice.
Thank you, Rüdiger, very much indeed. A wonderful character and very poignant as well. And the whole idea of mythology and her half face, and yes, we could go much further with Iris, but she is only one of several women in this novel. And I wanted to just bring in the next woman in Lionel's life, who is called Claudia Maria Rochelle, and she's Swiss. And she is basically, she's a stalker initially. She's an internet stalker. She, just to tell all of you watching and listening, Claudia is an avid reader of Lionel's articles, and she copies them and cuts them out and keeps them all. And she somehow manages to get his email address, and she starts to send him very explicit emails. And he obviously thinks, why should he even respond to them? she's a bit bonkers. But then he finds himself drawn into this and does respond, and she becomes a very important part of his life. But I was going to suggest to you that what Claudia personifies is an obsession. He's obsessed by somebody else, she's obsessed, and the whole story is about obsessions and passions and you know, how we get them wrong, and how we can be lonely even if we are very passionate about certain things. It's about solitude as well. And these two characters, Claudia and Lionel, I think really do show us the roots of solitude and loneliness. Now, how did you come up with, why did you come up with Claudia? Because she's very strange, even stranger than Iris. And she's troubling, I think. I felt very troubled by her.
She is troubling, and she is troubled. She is deeply troubled. As you said, her obsession doesn't find a proper channel. She thought she had found that channel in Lionel, in the, or let's be precise, in the author of these texts that she liked, that she admired, that she felt almost possessed by. She writes to him, as you say. She is very explicit in many ways, but also her explicitness in that sense is a veil. It is not that clear what she really wants, and I think she herself can't be clear about this either. You are right in the sense also that two obsessions meet here. Lionel's obsession with language, with the female, without being too directed, as it were. And here we have a female who does not quite know what it is that drives her. And you are right also, yes, it is ultimately Claudia who will almost take over his life, and to a certain extent it is his fate, this figure, but even more so, she is the victim ultimately of her obsession. Now she is, and I have no segment here that I will read about Claudia or the Claudia, but what I think is very important here is also the Swiss background, is the Swiss context. It all plays, as you mentioned earlier on, in Lucerne. The actual encounter between the two, which isn't in so many ways a non-encounter, like all of these Lionel Flower encounters. This encounter takes place in a very crystal clear, very clean environment, in something that is pristine and over pristine. And at the same time, this pristineness, as it were, turns upside down through these two figures. There is a very fine phrase, and in this case, I would like to refer to an author because you mentioned other authors. There is a very special phrase by Rainer Maria Rilke when he says that two lovers can in fact appoint each other, this is a direct quotation, can appoint each other's solitude. It is the solitude that they grant each other, and in many ways this is, if you ask for one particular thought that has perhaps governed in a sense the creation or the self-creation of Lionel Flower, it is that he does appoint others to guard his solitude, vice versa. And with Claudia, it doesn't seem to work because she is not ready for this. And something else has to happen that will enact this in an unexpected fashion, in an unexpected way. We won't talk about that.
No giveaways here.
No giveaways.
We try very hard not to give too much away. But while you mention these other authors, I'm going to try and trick you into talking a little bit about possible influences, because I do see them through the novel, and it's inevitable. I mean, you've written so much about so many German writers, German language writers, Austrian, Swiss, and artists as well. I know that music and art are very important to you as well. And I wonder, you know, that they're all crowding your head. They're all in there somewhere. How do you get rid of them when you're writing your own work?
You can't get rid of them on the one hand. On the other hand, you have to, or rather you have to allow their traces to be the patterns of your subconscious somehow. And as you have noticed in the section I read, patterns play a very important part in this novel. The Marbel Song, after all, is about a pattern. It is about the marble pattern on the marble floor. And there is a certain meaning connected with this, which again, we don't have to disclose here. But what happens with influences, I think, is something you can only tell with hindsight. Once you have written a text, I think you are clearer, that is to say, a non-academic text or a non-essayistic text. You are clearer, perhaps, about the dominance, the perhaps even preeminence of a certain way of writing, a particular style. And I would say that this is more prominent than the actual writer's name, is the stylistic register. So the style that you find appealing will, of course, also change from your early years, from the beginnings of your life as a writer and academic, and how it develops. So, for example, I would always maintain that, talking about English literature, or rather Anglophone literature, yes, for a long time, I was completely taken by Henry James. I was for quite some time also very preoccupied with the writings of A.S. Byatt, for example. I regard her very highly. But it is then when I say I was taken by their stylistic approaches. And that is the kind of thing that I would regard as the pattern of writing. And somehow it seems that without necessarily being aware of this, it somehow creeps into your own text. It creeps, and that's important. As soon as this would become a conscious act, you might as well bin it. Then it's gone, that is useless.
And then the magic of fiction takes over, because yes, that is that is you there. I mean, you've said as well before that you can only ever understand other poets if you write your own poetry. And I imagine that's the same process here for you. If you can only ever understand great literature if you attempt to write it yourself. Or you can only, I won't say great literature, you can only ever understand literature or fiction if you attempt to let yourself go.
Yes. Into
that process.
Indeed, and I mean, let's be duly modest here. If one looks around, it could, in fact, when you look at the unspeakable achievements of writers throughout the ages, it can silence you. It can certainly silence you, and at the same time, this shouldn't happen either. There is a great value in silence, and at the same time, when you write about silence, that can become interesting. We will remember perhaps on the 1st of November, Ilse Eichinger as one of the great voices of Austrian literature. And she wrote about silence and being silent in all variations. And the results are remarkable. But when it comes to how you react to a great example, to a great model, perhaps, I always think of both Brahms and Schumann, who clearly said, what can we do after Beethoven? It is impossible. And it took them years and years and years to really overcome this and find their own tone, find their own voice. And I think this is the most difficult challenge. Again, you can't consciously start a text by saying, I now want to find my voice. It happens or it doesn't. And again, if it doesn't happen, leave it alone and put it aside. But occasionally one is perhaps lucky, and the voice comes through, the own voice comes through.
Let's return to the novel and prepare for your second reading. And this is when I realized who you were writing about, this was a very special moment for me, remarkable, in fact, because only a few days ago, I was interviewing another very famous author who turned out to be the person you were actually writing about. She's in real life, her name is Siri Hustvedt, and she's a Norwegian-American author. And Lionel Flower becomes obsessed by somebody similar, very similar to Siri Hustvedt, who you or Lionel calls Hedda Söderfeld. And she is, I mean, she's an amazing character, and she's very recognizable as Siri. So I don't think you're really hiding too much. And Siri stroke Hedda has a husband called Aaron, who is obviously Paul Auster, Siri Hustvedt's own husband. Now, you've obviously read everything that Siri Hustvedt has written, because you quote many of her tropes, many of her interests in writing. She's, as many people will know, she's a great essayist. She's also a very great novelist, and she's a very great thinker. And a lot of her characteristics come through in the character of Hedda. And this is Lionel's, this is Lionel's, one of Lionel's big obsessions, and it's probably the one that takes over the second half or 2/3 of the novel, and with very, very interesting results. So tell us why you yourself became so obsessed with Siri Hustvedt that you wanted to include her in your novel.
Like yourself, and I think the coincidence is extraordinary that you had this interview with her.
And that I know her work and know her quite well.
Indeed,
amazing.
Yes.
I couldn't believe it.
I don't know her personally. I do know at least some of her work. I was struck by, again, the voice that comes through in these texts by Siri Hustvedt. And I was struck by, indeed, precisely this combination of a reflection, a reflectiveness that comes across as a very subtle engagement with thought. And then you have this very, shall we say, colorful language, which is also there. And this blend of both intrigued me immensely. So, and then you have her courage to turn intellectual arguments into something that is palatable to the ordinary reader, or the common reader, to use Virginia Woolf's phrase. I give you one tiny example. It was one of the perhaps not so known novels by her, a very short novel, in fact, The Summer Without Men. The Summer Without Men is, for me, very striking because that's precisely what she does there. She describes a female who, in fact, is suddenly challenged with a reality that she had never thought of, namely a pause in the relationship that she has and that she cherishes. And this pause that is demanded by her partner makes this female character reflect on all sorts of things, including particular encounters that she had, for example, with someone who can move with ease from Galileo to Heisenberg, etc., etc. So when I read this novel, and I have to say that Siri Hustvedt's work is a relatively recent discovery of mine. Perhaps the intensity of this reading experience stems from there, that I simply read one after the next, as it were. When I say recent, I mean perhaps the last 10 years or so.
Yes, I mean, she's the interesting thing is that many of the issues which you bring up,
yeah,
or you thread through your own novel, are similar. She writes about psychoanalysis and psychological insight and the need for creativity, art. She writes she writes broadly and very frequently about the visual arts, and she writes observations of life and of human life. And she suffers greatly from migraine, and she has what are called the shakes, and she spent a lot of time herself in her writing trying to understand these neurological this neurological condition that she has. Now, all this is the reason I mention it is because it is all part of your character Hedda's personality, her character. And you've got a passage for us about Hedda. And Hedda is, in Lionel's life, she is somebody he's going to write about, isn't it? Really, that's how Hedda features. She is incredibly important to him, central to his life. She overtakes all the other women for a while. And then he decides he's going to write her biography. Because it suddenly becomes clear to him, doesn't it, who he's going to write about.
Indeed.
And so there's a kind of pursuit that goes on as well, but he doesn't actually meet her until much later on. So I'll leave the rest to you and to your reading and any other explanations I've forgotten to include there.
The explanations follow. And what about Hedda? That evening had been peculiar, odd even. When Lionel thought of it, the word eerie came to mind. Hedda personified eeriness. Yes, she looked stunning, tall and unbelievably blonde. The face really was like the one on the publicity photos. It was a face that left the viewer stunned. The cold eyes, seductive lips, and an uncompromising profile. In short, the face of a kingfisher. Her amazing parchment-like complexion fascinated him. It was not clear whether the illumination caused this stunning effect or whether Hedda herself really radiated some pale blue shimmer, as if her body was electrically charged. Lionel felt drawn to those lips that bordered on perfection, but he wondered whether anyone could ever bring him or herself to kiss them, or for that matter, whether those lips could ever bring themselves to kiss other, inevitably less perfect lips. Not to speak of those unbearable eyes. Surely, even when they were shut, those pupils could see through the parchment lids. It was unthinkable that they were ever asleep. She was introduced by whoever as the future winner of all notable literary prizes, the swirling star of the writing profession. There was a distinct smell of talcum powder in the air, not incense. Then the multimedia presentation superimposed Van Gogh's Starry Night, Saint-Rémy, 1889, onto a stage where the Perspex lectern was positioned on a talus-like pedestal of fake marble. Hedda was multiplied on various large screens, which served to illustrate just how perfect her makeup was. She looked simultaneously completely natural and entirely artificial. The Hedda event was clearly designed for larger audiences and venues, not churches, whether deconsecrated or not. They should have chosen the Cadogan Hall, Lionel thought, or at least the Purcell Room, or even one of those former cinemas that have been turned into multi-purpose venues. In the wings on one side of where the altar used to be, Lionel noticed a bunch of roses that were already drooping in the heat from the stage lights. Only those people like Lionel who knew Hedda really well would have detected fatigue, if not exhaustion, in that amazing face of hers. Despite her radiance, she looked gaunt, strained, ready to throw in the towel. The introduction was followed by some thin, tired applause. There were projections of Norwegian fjords coupled with some of those hideously fascinating New York streets. One electronic installation blended the Norwegian flag and the Stars and Stripes. Some Edward Grieg and Cole Porter were interwoven. One installation was called Tribute to the Local Venue. It showed two females, a nun and a woman, wearing a tichel, each embracing a birch tree, Esther and Ruth. Clearly, even though together their names sounded more like the title of an all-female sitcom or a female detective series or some other double act. Lionel considered writing an article about this event. Hedda Södervedt in Town, or Orthodox about writing. But he was not here to write an article. He had come to be near her. Here she really was. No interviews, maybe, but there would surely be other ways of getting closer to her. Hedda stood still for quite some time with her eyes fixed on the marble pedestal. She wore a light grey suit with a blue neck scarf, which gave her an immaculate look. She did not use a cliched opening remark such as, "How nice to be here with you tonight," or "Hey, fancy you being here." Her opening line was, "We are engulfed by shadows." She did not get any further, but started to tremble. Soon she was shaking uncontrollably. She looked like a tree exposed to a strong wind, or a huge bird, a crane perhaps, strapped to the ground by wanting to take off. And yet, there was no sign of agitation or panic in her face. It still looked composed. The audience was perplexed. Murmurs went through the rows like small waves, as if triggered by Hedda's shaking arms and a swaying of her body, which made her look like she was praying at an invisible wailing wall. Meeting her backstage was now unthinkable. Surely in that condition, she would need medical assistance. The shaking would not stop. It resembled an epileptic fit, and yet her face remained calm, serene almost. It was strange, though, that no one in Hedda's entourage made any effort to help her. Nor did she give any indication that her presentation should be interrupted, if not terminated. It became clear to the audience that this must have happened to her before, probably often. She would pull through this fit and be the stronger for it. Perhaps, perhaps not. Lionel did not want to find out. He got up and left. This was not Hedda, not his Hedda, his icon, his Norwegian-American goddess, his idol of a writer. Hedda was not Hedda, but a woman as shaky as a human aspen tree.
Thank you again. Another wonderful passage, really, really wonderful. And I just wanted to ask you two related questions there. Hedda herself, the writer, has written a book about Marbel called The Patterns of Marbel. And Marbel and the Marbel Song, this does actually go, you do mention Marbel in many different instances and forms throughout the novel. When did you hit upon that idea of integrating Marbel in the way that you have?
Marbel is a long-standing fascination with me, I have to admit. And what I find so thrilling about Marbel is the frozen rhythm of the pattern. And when I first began to draft something along the lines of what became this novel, that was an image that I felt strongly about. And in fact, when I said earlier on that the voices of my characters in this novel demanded to be written in English, I could also say that, or I could add, that these Marbel patterns, they somehow challenged a particular form of writing. They challenged a particular way of representing them or doing something with them. You are right with your allusion, of course, to Siri Hustved's text on marble. In my case, it is her looking onto a marble floor, and that is what matters there. And of course, also the fact that Lionel is at that stage not yet clear whether he would write more about her or not, that at some stage he will be charged with writing a biography, but not only on her, but he's charged with writing a double biography, a dual life, as it were, a dual life on her and her husband. And that, of course, is a project that somehow is bound to fail, because he is so preoccupied with this one writer, this one element of this marriage, writers. He is so preoccupied with working out this fascination with her. Or perhaps he isn't, perhaps he can't, perhaps even this biographical project is not an answer to his finding out what it really is that drives him.
But nevertheless, the marble, of course, all the threads of beautiful marble patterns and so on, is wonderful, dare I say, metaphor throughout the novel. And the second point I wanted to bring up was your admiration for intellectuals. Mm-hmm. Now, this may seem like an incredibly simplistic thing to say, but it is very clear, and also female intellectuals. You are, I could never accuse you of not holding women up with the greatest respect and regard. And in fact, I think Siri Husted is a great example of one of our greatest female intellectuals. You do have reverence for her and for this. In English, we're very, in England, in the UK, in Britain, we're very nervous about admiring intellectuals. I think you've probably got a license to do so, as you're German.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for saying this. I could only agree, it is absolutely true. And I think there is a particular element in intellectualism, which, I mean, admittedly, both male and female can bring this out, of course, but there is...
I'm not discounting that there are male intellectuals,
yes,
but
true,
I'm just rather excited about the fact that the main one here is actually a female intellectual.
And I have to say, I feel strongly about this, because obviously one of my, it is almost cliche, but it's also true, one of my first major impressions when I came as a student to this country in terms of English literature was, of course, Virginia Woolf. Mm-hmm. And I see Siri Hustvedt exactly in that league. It has something to do with a concept I've used in German ever so often, perhaps too often, I don't know. It is the sensuality of thought that I do feel strongly about, because I have never really regarded philosophical thought, intellectual debate as something abstract. From my point of view, an idea can be as tangible and essential as a touch. And if you are not touched by a certain idea, again, you might as well leave it. Mm. And I dare say that my Hedda, and Hedda is in that sense perhaps also a bit of a blend. She's not only the Siri Hustvedt. There is something when you talk about some, shall we say, naive elements, more naive elements in this character. There's a bit of Sylvia Plath in her. There's a little bit of yes, indeed, a legacy of Virginia Woolf in her, perhaps. Mm. Even though the situation is different. But this particular, shall we say, sensuality of thought is something I dare say that a female intellectual brings across much more impressively than a male colleague.
Under the chapter of Eros, if you like, which is again what Siri Hustvedt herself has written about. No, it is absolutely, it's an absolutely fascinating idea. Now, I'm just going to make sure that everybody realizes now that I'm going to invite people to put their questions to us. I'm sorry, I've been muting and not running the videos of everybody who's participating, but if you do have questions for Rüdiger Görner, please put them in the chat if you can, and if not, I can bring you up as well and you can talk to Rüdiger directly. But I'll keep the chat on now, so just make sure that everybody can see. Sorry about that, just working the controls because Peter Brock has had to leave. But if you would like to ask Rüdiger a question, please write it into the little chat box at the bottom of your screen there, and I can see that. Yes, you should be able to do that. So I should look out for the chat. I should be watching that, but I'll continue to ask Rüdiger some more questions. Rüdiger, one of the other very strong elements of the novel is location.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to sort of extrapolate a little bit and say, I mean, you locate the novel in London and in Lucerne and partly in Belfast, but as you yourself have mentioned with Lucerne and various other places, you know, that we've already talked about, there's also a yearning for place in this, and I'm going to use one of my favorite words, Heimat, because you and I absolutely understand that word, Heimat, because what he's trying to do is fill his void. He's trying to find a home somewhere. And I would love you to just talk a little bit about that and about roots, because the very opening chapter is a play on words about roots and identity. Can you tell me a little bit more about your thinking there?
It is certainly a strong feature in this text that the characters are in pursuit of roots. They try to find their own roots, but in so doing, they are increasingly uprooted. One can't even say they uproot themselves, but in the way they are going about, perhaps this quest for Heimat, which is probably the strongest in Claudia, because she is very localized, as it were. She is in Lucerne, and that is seemingly it. But it's quite clear that she is not at home there either. Lionel is someone, yes, he's English, but he's hovering. He's hovering from one place to another. Admittedly, only 3 in this case, you're right. But still, they symbolize for him actually the impossibility of rooting properly. His dwellings in London are also quite interesting, I think. Because he lives in a flat which is part of a converted church. And when you talk about elements of irony here, there is quite a lot of it. And I think it is not for nothing that the uprooted sacred place, as it were, is also the location of our uprooted character. And even if he thinks that he can find a sense of belonging with particular people that he meets, e.g. females, that of course is an illusion. In other words, this book in so many ways has something to do with the illusion of Heimat. And Heimat in a conventional sense simply has lost not its meaning, but its reality. And we are hunting behind the meaning of Heimat, but we have problems with the actual identification of what a location is that could provide a sense of Heimat as we had it, for example, in the fiction of the 19th century. Think of Adalbert Stifter. So that's gone. That seems to be not present anymore. It is not tangible anymore. And the more concrete the way is in which the narrator describes a location, the more suspicious the reader should become, because that is not, in that sense, real. The realities that I refer to, including the objects that Iris counts and puts in her inventory, they are almost surrogates. They are surrogates for something that is no longer really tangible.
Rüdiger, we have got a question for you from Friedrich Rittenhouse, and he says Rüdiger's command of the English language and his way of thinking and talking is making me want to ask, does he dream in English or in German? Very good question.
That is an interesting question. Yes, indeed. Sometimes in a mixture, but strangely enough, in dreams, locations actually play quite an important role. And the transition from one location to another, I would say the images are much stronger than the language is. It is not so much dreaming in German or dreaming in English, it is more dreaming in locations. And sometimes I have to say, sometimes it always surprises me too when I remember it, in sounds.
Do you see your own Heimat now broadly in Britain or in Germany, or are you still very happy to belong to both?
It sounds a bit like ducking the question, but it's not. When I say that it has developed in a way that I feel a sense of Heimat where I happen to be. And that I think is key. That is key. So where you find that you can ultimately work best, that's where you feel perhaps the most present.
And you're living in Britain currently. I know you've just spent some time in Germany, but you are living in Britain at a very challenging time, to say the least. Not only have we got the challenges of the pandemic, but we have Brexit. You were with us on that journey as we departed the European Union, and you've written about it. You've also written about Europe and your feelings about Europe as well. When you look at us going through, as I said, British going through what we've gone through, particularly with Brexit, do you stand back, or do you understand how we have got to this stage in this country?
Occasionally, I try to stand back and try to observe and to analyze, but one is too wrapped up in it. One is too wrapped up in it. And I think the state we are in, to use Will Hutton's phrase, the state we are in is a pretty problematic one for both reasons that you mentioned. And I think we have been in a situation where, and you talked about the sense of belonging of certain characters in this piece of fiction, but I think this country in particular has sincere problems with its identity. And this has come out before Brexit already, but I think Brexit has exacerbated this. And there are all sorts of things and maneuvers, as we all know, to patch this up. But I don't think one can patch it up. This is also, if you look at bookshelves about Britain in the last 10 years or so, the question of what is English in particular was the substance of many a book, as you know, as we know. And that is a symptom. Even Paxman wrote a book on
Jeremy
England.
Paxman, yeah.
Yes, Jeremy Paxman, What is England? Indeed, what is England? And I think this is something which now there is much more urgency to redefine the identity of these isles. And it is not
also surely to redefine the identity of these isles as Europeans, because just because we have left the European Union does not mean that we have stopped being European. And I think that is a major challenge for many of us, particularly, working in if you like, more broadly, the creative industries, as we call them. I think, we don't want to lose the mainland. We want to participate.
Indeed, and of course one has to say, it is also stating the obvious, Europe is more than just the European Union. But Europe would be next to nothing as a legacy after 1945 without the European Union. we don't have to move into a Brexit discussion here away from the Marbel Song, but when you talk about patterns of thought, when you talk about patterns of not the marble, but in this case, political behavior, then I think you have a perfectly apt analogy with the marble figurations in stone. When you look at the way in which our political behavior has in fact shaped up. And without wishing to be too, shall we say, down to earth in political terms, that's perhaps not necessary at this stage. But it is deeply worrying the way in which we, on these shores, have handled these matters. Deeply worrying.
Let's come back to the novel to end this event. And you've got another short reading for us as well, which I think will perfectly complement everything we've been talking about. But I also wanted to ask you first whether you're going to write another novel in English, and whether you will, of course, include the whole Brexit experience and the pandemic, because I do wonder about writers, you know, for the next few years. Surely you won't be able to avoid Brexit or the pandemic if you're writing about this subject matter here and now.
It is a very difficult question indeed, and I can't answer you properly whether I would write this in English or in German. Again, I would say that the subject matter would probably dictate this almost. But I agree entirely. We can neither avoid Brexit as a topic on the long run, nor can we avoid the truly appalling effect of the epidemic. I feel that a lot will have to be said about this very awkward double legacy. A lot will have to be said about the way we can find an adequate language for both to actually express what we feel, what we think. And no matter what happens at either end, with Brexit or with Corona, the Corona legacy, we will have to find proper parables to actually express this. There's no point in doing this journalistically, in my view. There has to be a literary ambition at some stage, but this needs time. In my view, it is a mistake to write very quickly now a short story or a novel about Corona. No, I think we have to allow time for this. These things have to mature, and by which I mean our thinking about the scale of what has happened, the scale to what we are exposed now. And this is something I honestly think we haven't even grasped the beginning of these legacies. So there is a lot of work for all of us.
Well, at least there's, as you say, there's a lot of work for writers.
Yes.
That's good news. Now you're going to give us a final reading, and we're not going to give anything away about what actually happens to Lionel. And I would actually point out that even though I'm going to hold up the wonderful book cover again, the patterns of marble and the pencil, many of the issues we've been talking about and have been, I think, intensely profound and interesting for me to hear you talk about them. But the novel itself is a really great read. Now, it's not a crime novel, but it does have, I'm sure you could write one of those too, a great English crime novel, Anglo-German crime novel. But it does have a galloping narrative, and it's a really wonderful read, and I do encourage everyone to read it. But it has not just a narrative arc, it has a philosophical, it has a psychological arc as well. And you're going to end by helping us, letting us enter Lionel Flower's mind a little bit more deeply. So if you'd be kind enough to give us your final reading, Rüdiger, over to you.
Gladly. The pale blue of the hydrangeas in the foyer of the Bayerische Hof matched the color of Hedda's eyes. When she approached Lionel, the hotel staff were busy removing the posters with her photo and his sentence. She seemed more formal to Lionel than at yesterday's reception. He assumed she had had a bad night. Perhaps she was suffering from a severe headache, for she looked paler than usual, and this paleness did not result from an excess of face powder. After all, in questions of makeup, Hedda was as subtle as in her writings. Lionel knew from various sources that dreadful headaches had been one of Hedda's main health problems before the uncontrollable shaking set in. Seeing her now, Lionel remembered what he had read at the time about her condition. Apparently, she had suffered a loss of fluid caused by a tear in the spinal membrane. Doctors identified the tear and managed to mend it. But Lionel's concerns were unfounded. Hedda was quite herself and fit enough to stun him with her opening shot. "Who are you, Lionel?" "Very well, how are you?" "Don't be so English, Lionel. You know what I ask you. Not how, but who are you, my friend? I mean, we are about to hand over your lives to you. And I'm sure you won't be surprised to find that Aaron and I need to know a bit more about you when you write our biography." At least the purpose of this meeting, or rather interview, was now clear. Lionel was in the midst of a suitably check. He looked down at the patch of marble flooring and started humming. "It works," he exclaimed. "It really works, Hedda." "What works?" "Humming along the veins of the marble. It's a breakthrough, really. Are you all right, Lionel?" He told her about the free safe deposit in his local bank, promised by a voluptuous clerk. But he would have to memorize the lines of the marble and translate the humming into singing first before he could claim it. Hedda was slightly bewildered and asked him whether it was all worth it. He mentioned the promise of a special prize contained in the deposit he would be able to claim. Hedda's expression was rather depreciating. What she had just heard must have sounded rather childish to her. It seemed to have occurred to her that Lionel was perhaps not the best choice for the dual lives after all. And as for her main question, who he really was, who was he indeed? He could have replied, "I am a byproduct of coincidences."
An excellent place to stop. Who is Lionel Flower? That was the question we asked at the beginning, and you may still want to find out. I hope you do. I hope we've enlightened you all a little bit about who is Rüdiger Görner as well, and who is Lionel Flower. And I think the most wonderful thing about this book and about you, Rüdiger, is that all that you do, you write about, you speak about writing against futility, I think, and in the constant pursuit of something out of curiosity and a constant creativity. And I'm very grateful to you for that and for this wonderful conversation. Es war eine wahre Freude für mich. And I thank all of you for watching, all of you for listening, and do buy the book. Thank you to Peter Brock and everybody at the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft. And as in the words of Lionel, I would say every life was worth recording. Thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you, Rüdiger Görner. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.